Greetings, everyone. Great to have you all here. My name's Nicholas Norbrook. I have my fan club in. I'm managing editor of the Africa Report, part of Group Jeune Afrique. In fact, the Africa Report is really the part of the group that embodies this crucial zeitgeist of Africa investing in Africa. Group Jeune Afrique wants people living in Abuja to be up to speed with what's happening in Abidjan. An Africa that trades with itself is an Africa that has information about itself and not just information in the parts that share a common language. And so, as a gift to you all here, I have a special checkout code for you, ACF 2022. If you're keen on the Africa Report, just have a look first, and we'd love to have you on board. Some housekeeping: please keep your phones on silent for maximum enjoyment of your neighbors. This session will be in English and in French. If you need translation, please do grab an earpiece. So what's our subject today? In brief, Africa needs to get rich quick. And you know all the statistics around growth versus demographics, the injustice of the past, the failures of the present, the dangers of an increasingly hot future. So Africa needs to get rich quick. How do we do it? We heard a lot of great ideas on the panels this morning, but what's the actual levers that we have to implement this idea of Africa investing in Africa? And I think this panel here will really help unpack that. State-owned enterprises are currently on the continent some of the biggest players. So when I explained this to my wife, she was saying, "What's your panel again?" and was not so interested. I think this opportunity here is really to convince everyone that this is a critical sector. There are a lot of fairy tales told about state intervention, likewise about the role of the market. You can find examples to support any thesis, from free market fundamentalism to a wide-eyed, the state will solve anything approach. You can listen to famous shock therapy advocates like Milton Friedman, more recently Jeffrey Sachs, who say that the real problem is state intervention in markets, and the only solution is to free the market as soon as possible. But I think over recent decades, we've had a more nuanced view. If we look back over the last 70 years, the sprinters, the one who have broken out of the subsistence farming, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, China, to tell the story of these countries, you have to look at the role of the state in catalyzing investment, equitable land reform, supporting farmers, guiding resources into light industry, steering a course towards heavy industry where the big bucks are. It's South Korea's Samsung, which are now making phones that compete with their US counterparts, and it's Chinese telecoms companies that are now leading the global technology race. But of course, there are countries like Turkey, Romania, India, Chile, where there was an unleashing of the private sector, a removal of the license Raj, the overbearing weight, and let's say the corruption of the state that was stifling growth. So what about the continent? A few years ago, you could make the case that the most substantial economic activity is happening in countries following that East Asia development model: Rwanda, Ethiopia with its big manufacturing zones, Morocco, South Africa, Egypt, who've all got substantial state interventions in key sectors: car making, renewables, export processing. The picture's obviously grey in Africa too. Ethiopia seemed to neglect fundamental political truths in pursuit of growth. Benin has shown that freeing up the market does work wonders. So this discussion, we're going to try and get beyond the easy, quick fixes, ignore the fundamentalists, and look more at how much state, how much market, the sequencing. China has been a master in carefully sequencing the opening and closing of sectors of its economy. Why can't African countries do the same too? And I have an excellent slate of guests to help us understand all this in concrete detail, people who are at the top of their fields. We have from Namib National Reinsurance Corporation, one of the leading reinsurers of the continent, Hakim from the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Gabon, who we'll be talking about, the key way to funnel investment, patient capital. Modou Dianfara from Sonacos, who's playing a critical role in ensuring that the employment of farmers in Senegal is not just empty words. And I was gonna stumble over it, but I'm not. Mpumi Mpofo is the CEO of AXA, the airport company of South Africa, who you may not know has been operating and running airport terminals across the continent, including next door in Accra. The most important of all is yourselves in the room, the collective wisdom that we have here. So I'd like to make a quick poll, just to get your own thoughts on this first, before I bring in our expert, Moez Ajmi. So I'm going to read out 3 statements. You're going to tell me which one you agree with. Statement A, you want the state to help domestic actors grow in your country. B, you do not want the state to help domestic actors grow in your country. Or C, you like, in principle, the idea of the state to help catalyze growth, but you just don't trust your current government. So, who agrees with A, you want the state? Okay. B, you do not want the state. And C, you like the idea, but you just don't trust the current lot. Okay. There's a couple there. I'd like to ask Moez Ajmi, who's responsible for EY in France, Maghreb, and French-speaking Africa, to give us some perspective on this.
Merci, merci Nick pour cette introduction. Bonjour à toutes et à tous, et merci pour le choix de sujet qui est fort stratégique pour le continent. Alors, les entreprises publiques constituent une pièce essentielle dans les politiques des gouvernements, de par leur rôle instrumental sur les plans politiques, économiques et sociaux. Alors, ce rôle diffère d'un pays à l'autre, mais il y a souvent 2 indicateurs qui reviennent souvent lorsqu'on entame une analyse des rôles des entreprises publiques dans les économies nationales, à savoir la création de richesse, la contribution dans la création de la richesse nationale, d'une part, et la contribution à l'emploi. Alors, il y a très peu de statistiques sur le continent africain, mais les tendances sont celles qu'on affiche ici, à savoir un nombre d'entreprises qui a significativement diminué sur les 30 dernières années, pour se situer à peu près à 3000 sociétés aujourd'hui, et un poids qui est, comme vous le voyez, très important, que ce soit en termes de pourcentage du PIB ou de pourcentage de l'emploi par rapport aux pays de l'OCDE. Aujourd'hui, sur le continent africain, un salarié sur 4 est issu du secteur public. Alors, où est-ce qu'on y trouve ces sociétés ou ces entreprises nationales? C'est principalement, les entreprises publiques, c'est principalement dans les secteurs un peu stratégiques, sensibles en termes de souveraineté des États africains, les ressources naturelles bien évidemment, le transport, l'énergie et la télécommunication. Alors, où en sont les entreprises publiques aujourd'hui africaines? Alors, si on met de côté les quelques exceptions, les quelques success stories, mais aujourd'hui, les entreprises publiques africaines traversent des situations un peu compliquées, difficultés de trésorerie, pertes financières qui pèsent sur les budgets nationaux, des investissements qui sont souvent surdimensionnés, des effectifs en surnombre, une mauvaise gestion, mauvaise gouvernance et des affaires de corruption qui s'éclatent par-ci par-là. Alors, face à cette situation, les gouvernements n'ont pas 36 000 choix. Donc, soit on va procéder à la privatisation des entreprises, soit on va les liquider s'il n'y a pas de repreneur, soit la troisième alternative que j'adore, à savoir entamer un vrai programme de transformation, ou ce qu'on appelle le courage de transformer pour redresser la barre et retrouver une santé financière. Alors, concernant ce programme de transformation, quels sont les piliers de tel programme? Donc ici, juste un petit résumé issu de notre expérience, l'expérience d'EY dans l'accompagnement de sociétés d'entreprises publiques. Alors, premier pilier, l'autonomie par rapport à l'État. L'État doit se contenter de son rôle d'actionnaire majoritaire et laisser la gestion des affaires à la direction générale. Deuxième pilier, avoir un équilibre entre les objectifs nationaux et les objectifs commerciaux. Troisième pilier, optimisation de la productivité, donc qui passe par l'amélioration de la performance, le recours au digital par exemple. Quatrième pilier, la qualité des services. Une entreprise publique doit se doter d'indicateurs pour mesurer la satisfaction de sa clientèle. Cinquième pilier, voir d'autres marchés, plus de marchés sur le plan régional, sur le plan international. Sixième pilier, diversifier les sources de financement pour pouvoir investir et croître. Donc pourquoi pas faire appel à des investisseurs privés tiers ou l'ouverture du capital ou encore recourir à de la dette bancaire. Septième levier, avoir un capital humain formé, compétent, pas que sur les aspects techniques, mais aussi sur les sujets soft skills. Et enfin, avoir un seul objectif, à savoir la création de valeur. Alors, quelles sont les difficultés qu'on rencontre souvent lorsqu'on accompagne une entreprise publique dans son programme de transformation? Alors, c'est ce qu'on cite ici, encore une fois issu de notre expérience dans ce genre de mission. Donc, souvent, c'est le manque de moyens et de compétences. Alors, un programme de transformation nécessite d'avoir un sponsor, voire des sponsors qui sont capables de résoudre les situations en cas de blocage. Manque d'engagement des people et des équipes. Ce qu'on conseille souvent les entreprises publiques, c'est de décliner le programme de transformation en plusieurs chantiers pour appliquer ou pour mobiliser l'ensemble des équipes dans l'entreprise. Ceci nécessite aussi une politique de communication interne pour faire accepter les changements. Une autre difficulté, c'est d'avoir des objectifs irréalistes, très ambitieux. Donc notre conseil, c'est plutôt d'avoir un périmètre bien défini pour bien mesurer les commitments de chacun. Et enfin, j'ai cité le dernier point aussi qui est important, à savoir les procédures, les process. Aujourd'hui, on n'a pas le temps, il faut agir vite. Et donc, il est important pour l'entreprise publique de simplifier son dispositif. Alors, avant de redonner la parole à Nick et à son panel prestigieux, donc, on cite ici les trois points importants à évoquer concernant ce panel. Donc, premier point sur le modèle opératoire pour créer plus de valeur de ces entreprises publiques. Deuxième volet sur la gouvernance et la transparence. Et troisième levier, comment peut-on faire pour avoir ou pour créer des champions africains parmi ces entreprises publiques. Nick, je te redonne la parole.
Thank you so much. If I could get the mic. Merci. Merci, Moez. Thank you for those useful questions as well. I think those are guiding principles that we should all keep in mind. Akim, first principles. The state can open pathways for development that are not open to the private sector. No one from the private sector wants to invest in tertiary roads, but everyone wants rich farmers who can purchase goods and create a strong local economy. That raises the question then of sustainability. How do we get the good things that we want, that state-owned enterprise can help us get, while still remembering that, you know, as we saw here, many state-owned enterprises are in serious financial difficulties. How do we build in sustainability as well as these other developmental goals? And can we? Is it fair to say that we need to hold both of those objectives in mind at the same time? Could we have the...
It's better now, I think, yeah.
It's better?
Sorry, yeah. Better when you turn it on. The reality is we need to correct a misconception. Even government, when you look at the magnitude of the challenges, government are not running charities. It's not sustainable. And when you look at the government coffers, whichever country it is on the continent, and you put it into perspective with the challenges, you realize that government coffers alone will not be sufficient. And put it back into context. By 2040, you will have 500 million people added to the urban population on the continent. These people will need roads, real estate, energy, transport. That's one side of the equation. On the other side, you have countries that are ongoing a transition process. If you take the example of Gabon, we're moving from a country that has been exporting raw material to a country that is now exporting processed goods. And for that, we need energy. And all these infrastructure are capital intensive. Now, I clearly understand that private sector will be reluctant to come alone. And that's why you need strong SOEs with strong governance that will be able to capture those direct investment. And that's what, for instance, you will have a sovereign wealth fund like the one in Gabon, and I can illustrate that really quickly. When you look at the energy sector today, we have a pipeline of $1.2 billion of investment under development and going toward financial close. But the direct investment of the sovereign wealth fund in this pipeline will be around 120 million alone. And the remaining funds are coming from co-investments and development financial institutions. But that's because we were able to provide sense of good governance and give comfort for investors saying that you have a local partner. In our case, it's a sovereign wealth fund. In other cases, it will be an SOE, where you do have alignment of interest. And you can ensure, like I like to say, that we'll be sharing the sleepless night. And that's something that works well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Mpumi, we have seen this clearly in South Africa, a country that's bucked the trend of the 80s and 90s on the continent when we had to privatize everything. It still maintains strategic control over its network infrastructure. So what's that allowed South Africa to achieve in terms of spreading development about more evenly?
The South African context is actually quite important. 2 times the size of France, 5 times the size of the UK, with infrastructure covering possibly about 40% of the population, with an urgent need to spread that to the entire population in far-flung rural areas. So ownership, continued ownership of network industries, and particularly the network infrastructure SOE is critical to carry out a socio-economic mandate of reaching areas where the private sector would never reach. South Africa maintains SOEs in the port, rail freight, passenger, airports, roads, pipelines, environments, controls and allows them to operate as efficient SOEs that can indeed raise money in the private sector, remain sustainable and be able to deliver both on a profitable basis and meet the socio-economic needs of the country that the population so direly needs. What's actually also important is in that particular context, the major infrastructure programs that have been led are directed by a government plan and a government program which continues to ensure the population has access to all the infrastructure they require. But I think what's important in terms of the African continent is there's very South African SOEs have played and continue to play a critical role in contributing towards catalyzing development on the continent. South African SOEs are involved very much in the Agenda 2063 program, particularly the Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative, on the big projects on the continent that are required in order to help meet the needs of Africa. In my particular industry of aviation, we are key players in what is called SATAM, which will allow for the full liberalization of air transport services. We, therefore, as airport company, provide services to many countries where we can. Airlines as well, state-owned, would be able to play a critical role with respect to that. What's the biggest opportunity for us in this context as SOEs is actually catalyzing and facilitating the African free trade area, because I really believe it's only investments that are made, public investments that are made. We believe in aviation, who are the most ready, able, agile, safest sector to facilitate free trade in the continent. We believe there's also investments in the medium to long term that will come from ports, roads, and other sectors, but they have all long lead times that really will take 5 to 10 years to get to. We see the opportunity in aviation of coming together under ACI Africa and providing that immediate solution of aviation facilitating free trade, which in fact becomes the most important priority of trade facilitation in our countries to enable growth, development, and also increasing the manufacturing base.
Fantastic. Modou, on parlera de l'histoire de Sonacos dans juste un instant, mais juste sur cette idée des priorités de développement qu'un pays, qu'un continent peut avoir. Les entreprises étatiques peuvent jouer un rôle. Si on pense à les centaines de millions de jeunes qui vont arriver sur le marché de travail dans ces décennies à venir, des secteurs qui sont intensifs dans l'utilisation de la manœuvre, c'est quelque chose assez critique pour tout le monde. Où est-ce qu'est le rôle de l'agriculture de l'agriculture et des entreprises étatiques?
Je vous remercie. Je crois que la Sonacos, pour ceux qui ne le connaissent pas, est la société qui s'occupe de la transformation des graines d'arachide en huile brute et en tourteau. Et ceux qui connaissent bien le Sénégal aussi savent que la principale culture de rente du Sénégal est l'arachide. Et la saison des pluies ou l'hivernage mobilise plus de 3 millions d'acteurs, donc qui tirent leurs gains, leurs épargnes de cette culture. Donc quand on parle de la création de richesses ou de la création d'emplois, bien entendu, la Sonacos qui régule cette filière arachidière au Sénégal joue un rôle important. Et aujourd'hui, la tendance doit être d'encourager les jeunes qui sont à la recherche d'un emploi, d'encourager les jeunes à aller vers l'agriculture, accompagner les jeunes à devenir de véritables entrepreneurs agricoles, parce que bien entendu, il faudra travailler à moderniser aussi nos agricultures, à moderniser aussi nos méthodes culturelles pour intéresser les jeunes qui sont à la recherche d'une occupation. Bien entendu, je crois que nous avons tous compris en Afrique maintenant que tous les jeunes ne peuvent pas se retrouver derrière un bureau pour pouvoir participer à la construction du Sénégal. Et dans ce cadre-là, un certain nombre d'initiatives sont prises pour aider les jeunes, pour les accompagner, pour aller dans l'agriculture. Et les industries de transformation de nos matières premières, en tout cas une industrie comme la Sonacos, emploie aussi énormément de jeunes. Et l'importance de cette boîte, c'est que c'est une boîte qui ne se limite pas seulement à Dakar, mais c'est une boîte aussi qui est dans les régions. Et dans toutes les régions du Sénégal où la Sonacos est implantée, elle est la principale pourvoyeuse d'emplois. Donc, c'est une société importante. Et bien entendu, tout dépend de la disponibilité de la matière première qui est l'arachide. Nous avons nos contraintes personnelles, bien entendu. Peut-être qu'on va y revenir. Mais nous avons quand même 2500 emplois directs et plus de 15 000 emplois indirects parce qu'il y a beaucoup de métiers qui dépendent de l'agriculture et qui dépendent de la transformation de l'arachide.
Merci. C'est un secteur critique. Patty, I guess we shouldn't kid ourselves. State-owned companies do come with risk. One should aspire to be South Korea, but many state-driven experiments resemble more what you can see north of the border in Korea. More Pyongyang than Samsung. So how do we best orient these companies? The profit motive can be seen as a dirty word in some quarters, not at the CEO Forum, obviously. Perhaps the profit motive should be the guiding principle for state-owned enterprises, ensuring we have proper financial management, ensuring even if you're in a sector like mass provision of water that's not likely to make much profit, at least you're structuring it in such a way that that could be the ultimate goal. One moment. Excusez-moi, est-ce qu'on peut avoir le micro pour madame? It's okay?
Yes, if I take the Namibian context, yes, we do have quite a number of state-owned enterprise, and they do make out quite a substantial amount of the providing jobs. Like if you 1 in every 20 employees are employed by state-owned enterprises. So What I would like to say is that yes, with state-owned enterprises, you do have different models, and it also depends on the state or the government as to what specific objective and goal that enterprise has to do. So you will find the ones that are there for social, and then the ones that are for economic. So if I can take my example, is which is a reinsurer. We are in operation for approximately 20 years, and the first few years of operation, when we started to operate, we almost started obviously being subsidized by government, but that was also the only time. But then at that stage, there was also a provision for the entity not to pay any taxes. But as we have obviously started to make profits, we then are in a position to operate as on an economic level. So yes, I would like to agree that there are certain state-owned enterprises, whether you, like in our context also, our word, especially our power utility, they operating as one of the biggest state-owned enterprises and also quite profitable as well. So it is possible for state-owned enterprises to operate successfully and profitably. And I would say there's different components that will make it happen. Obviously, when one look at your management is very important, and your governance structure is also quite critical in the whole context, yes.
Fantastic. Mpumi, the Airports Company of South Africa has a 25% shareholding, which is, it used to be an Italian airline, airports company rather, and now it's the state pension fund, the PIC. How important do you think it is for a state-owned enterprise, building on this idea of that Patty had of the importance of proper corporate governance and financial structures? How important is it to have cross-shareholdings or other people involved in the capital to bring in fresh ideas, fresh skills, and sort of more transparency?
Thank you very much. Let me just correct that. The PIC owns 20% of the shareholding in Airports Company South Africa, and then we have a 5%, which is private minority shareholders. So the important thing we see in this is just initially what is required is alignment in the long-term strategic objectives. And the Public Investment Corporation lends itself well to that public mandate of government, and then requires commercial viability, sustainability, financial management that meets the interests of their own shareholders, which are really government pensioners. So what's important about that is the dilution of that equity in the hands outside of government with common objectives actually does bring success. What we found is that probably if you had private sector investors, that alignment in socioeconomic objectives would not always be met. But what it does bring, one is they have representation on the board with 2 non-executive directors who look after their interests. Secondly, the clear accountability. They've pushed us to go to ESG reporting as a matter of urgency so that we're aligned with either financial institution requirements, but also they keep the mandate of financial viability in promoting the non-aeronautical revenue generation component of our business. Airports Company South Africa has over 50% aeronautical revenue generation, but consistently, the PIC particularly pushes us to increase the non-aeronautical component, which includes commercial, retail, hotels, conferencing, office parks, and whatever else we can develop in an airport precinct that helps to sustain us, but also generates particular revenues for us, and so has sustained us, in fact, in the COVID environment. So that's quite an important element that they bring, and also just better accountability and dual accountability. It's not to suggest that government doesn't have that. In fact, our government proudly looks at Airports Company South Africa as a very successful SOE. We've been profitable for the last 28 years, with the exception of two years, one in 2008 because of an economic regulation problem, and then now with COVID, which has seen us, in line with global trends, been decimated to the point of 60% loss in our revenues. But importantly, that role that the PIC plays is to ensure higher standards of reporting, accountability, pushing the financial targets and ensuring we meet all our matrix, and also ensuring that we are accountable to another shareholder other than government, and consistently ensures that the commercial component of our business is given priority and the benefits thereof are only moved on to socioeconomic benefits elsewhere in our surrounding communities and to the rest of South Africa.
Thanks, Mpumi. I think we've stumbled across the first real takeaway of the session, which is if you are a state-owned enterprise, get other investors in. They'll bring you more than just corporate governance. They'll push you on your commercial. They'll give you ideas and help you develop in ways that you weren't expecting. I think that's really interesting. I think, Akim, blended finance is all the rage at the moment, and we've just heard about the benefits of having different sorts of capital in your structure. The Sovereign Wealth Fund is, by its nature, very patient, very long-termist. How does that help you, really? And to what extent can you pull in private sector? I mean, you started to build on that earlier, giving comfort to private sector investors. How are you structuring projects to both lean into your very, AAA status, but also pull in private sector operators?
Yes, I think for this one, it's like you said, I already touched upon it a bit earlier. It's really by having independent vehicles. For instance, in the energy sector again, in that sector, we have an independent vehicle where we pull in investors. They have their say into how we are leading the project and in the governance as well. And we're making sure that in terms of accountability, we respond to the highest standards. And the reality is they get that comfort because having a local partner such as a Sovereign Wealth Fund or an SOE, it helps reduce the misperception in terms of risk. Because thereof, you have a local partner who have an understanding of the environment and of the climate, the business climate, which can really help when it comes to developing those large infrastructures, which takes time. Because development time for, let's say, an hydro dam could go between 4 to 5 years. Then you have to add another 4 to 5 years for construction. That's already 10 years. So if you don't have a long-term partner who has interest, commercial interest, obviously, because you need to have that return on investment, but also commitment to the country, it won't work. Because that's already 10 years before generating your first dollar. Then you have to run a concession over 20 to 30 years. So that's really long-term and patient capital that you need. And like it was mentioned earlier, you also need more than patient capital. You need sustainable capital to ensure that the infrastructure that you build passes the test of time. And that's why you need a local partner.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hakim. Modou, dans l'histoire même de la Sonacos, on voit un peu les courants. Peut-être dans les années 80, c'était plus l'État doit être en première ligne. Ensuite, les années 90, plus privatisation. Ensuite, pour le futur, on ne sait pas, mais ce qu'on sait, c'est que vous avez su faire de la Sonacos une entreprise qui est rentable. Est-ce que vous pourrez expliquer un peu le périple de Sonacos?
Oui, la Sonacos a connu plusieurs évolutions. Elle est créée en 1975. Elle est devenue le fleuron de l'industrie agroalimentaire nationale. Elle était très riche. Elle employait beaucoup de personnes. Elle distribuait beaucoup de dividendes à l'État du Sénégal. Et finalement, on ne sait pas par quelle alchimie elle est tombée en faillite. Et je crois que les raisons, elles ont été évoquées tout à l'heure par celui qui a introduit le panel. Manque de transparence, sureffectif, un certain nombre de mots que nous connaissons bien en ce qui concerne les entreprises publiques. Et donc en 2005, l'État a été obligé de privatiser, espérant qu'avec la privatisation, la Sonacos allait se relever. Malheureusement, la privatisation a créé davantage de problèmes. Donc de 2005 à 2010, la société n'avait pas réussi à redémarrer. Et sous le magistère du président Macky Sall à partir de 2005, elle a été renationalisée. Elle a été renationalisée et aujourd'hui, l'État détient 99,9% donc des actions. Une portion assez congrue est réservée à quelques cadres de la boîte. Et donc, depuis cette date de la renationalisation, bien entendu en changeant de méthode de gestion, parce que je le dis souvent, on peut nationaliser une entreprise sans l'étatiser. On peut le nationaliser, c'est-à-dire ça appartient à l'État, l'État détient la majorité, mais la gestion doit rester une gestion presque privée. En tout cas, c'est un peu le modèle que nous avons expérimenté. Et parce qu'aujourd'hui, l'État n'intervient plus, l'État ne subventionne pas, c'est nous qui nous gérons, c'est nous qui payons nos salaires, c'est nous qui payons nos charges. Et nous pensons que ce modèle est en train de donner des résultats parce que voilà 3 exercices, 2019, 2020, 2021, où nous avons présenté des bilans positifs. Alors que quand nous prenions les rênes de la société, c'était un déficit de moins 7 milliards de francs CFA. Alors, c'est vous dire que c'est possible de trouver une formule intermédiaire. Oui, l'État est là, mais l'État n'intervient pas dans la gestion directe. L'État ne vous dit pas employez-moi tel, mettez tel dans tel, etc., et que vous gérez en respectant aussi les règles de la comptabilité, la 6.3, en respectant aussi le code des marchés publics et en insistant sur aussi la gestion d'un certain nombre de dépenses. Et tout cela, en tout cas, nous a permis, depuis quelques années, de voir un peu le bout du tunnel, de voir un peu le bout du tunnel, parce que les banques qui étaient parties sont revenues, nos partenaires financiers internationaux sont encore là pour nous soutenir, pour acheter la matière première. Je viens d'Égypte, à la conférence de la Banque islamique de développement, et pour vous donner un exemple, lors de la dernière campagne, nous avions sollicité 40 millions d'euros pour acheter les graines. Mais cette année, et pour l'année prochaine, on a sollicité 120 millions d'euros. Parce que nous sommes sûrs que nous pouvons collecter le maximum de graines et nous pourrons aussi transformer les graines pour aussi participer à la souveraineté alimentaire. Parce que pour ceux qui connaissent le Sénégal, on ne peut pas parler de souveraineté alimentaire sans l'huile. Je crois que tous vous connaissez le tchéboudienne qui est fait à base d'huile et de riz.
Merci. Parler du tieb va toujours marcher avec cette audience-là, je pense. I'm going to accelerate through some questions so that we have some time for Q&A with the hall. So feel free to give tight answers. Patty, let's talk about the idea of state-owned enterprises expanding beyond national boundaries, because there are opportunities there. But managing risk, I think, is a clear part of it. We've just heard the story of Sonacos in the 1990s, in its heyday, maybe got over-ambitious, overstaffed, and other problems came up. So, expanding over your national boundary line is a clear risk. How do you do it? What kind of things do you think about? Leakages, future generations, sustainability?
Thank you, Nick. Yes, when we, the nature of our business, which is reinsurance, it makes us to. The nature of our business, which is reinsurance, make us automatically to operate in the African market. So currently we do operate across 20 countries. But yes, it's still, you have to assess your risk. Obviously you look at the country risk that you are operating in, because obviously when you go into those countries, all types of risk you will first have to analyze to see what is, does it align with your company procedures. And then most of the time, yes, we are operating across the rest of Africa, so it is very critical for SOEs, if they can operate or share the knowledge amongst Africa, I think that should be the way to go. Because I think if we can together as state-owned enterprises broaden our scope or where we can deliver the service in another country, then yes, we should look at that. I think where we have also now reached as a company is also to look into expanding our physical presence into these countries as well.
Fantastic. And this really is the theme of the conference, Africa, investing in Africa. Mpumi, tell us a little bit about the opportunities in your sector.
Airports Company South Africa has had a global footprint since 2006. Riding on the multilateral agreements that our country has with several countries. So initially at that time, India, Brazil, South Africa had a trilateral agreement. We benefited from that in being able to develop Mumbai Airport, operate and manage it for the Indian government. We've just exited it in the last 6 months. Similarly, Brazil, Guarulhos Airport, we had a partnership, 10% stake in Guarulhos Airport. And that basically is a great benefit from us assisting in the IPSA, and now we expand that footprint into the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa multilateral agreements. The particular benefit we've had is technical expertise in airport development, management, operations, and maintenance. We are the go-to airport operating group compared to others globally. We compete with Lufthansa and Changi. On the African continent, we've seen development of airports more recently by Chinese banks and development companies. However, our observation is that they have no interest in operating, managing, or even technical assistance after the development program. We go into those airports, and we've been given opportunities in Ndola International, Kenneth Kaunda International in Zambia. We've provided technical assistance and operational readiness in Rwanda and also in Liberia. So our footprint is extensive, not only in the African continent, but also in the domestic market. South Africa has allocated Airports Company South Africa the largest 9 airports, responsible full capacity for 54 million passengers a year, the largest of which most people would know, OR Tambo, has capacity for 28 million passengers a year. However, South Africa has a lot of other airports which are provincially and owned by municipalities. We're in the process of signing up about 9 additional contracts to manage the airports run by provincial governments, for whom basically this is not their core competence, and under financial constraints, they are handing over that responsibility to Airports Company South Africa. So that technical expertise that we have is something we're able to sell. We win awards across. In fact, Changi is the best airport group in the world. Our Airports Company South Africa is the best on the African continent, and we sell that expertise across and are able to provide services to various countries. The real issue is we want to provide African solutions to African countries. The example of China illustrates the lack of commitment to staying through. Ghana, Accra, we did a 5-year concession, build, operate, transfer, and the capacity was built in Ghana, which we're able to leave behind. And we do so in many other countries with the intention of ensuring that we're able to develop that African capacity for airport operation management. As I said earlier, critical pillar for trade facilitation, for export, intra-Africa trade, and economic development on the continent.
So really there we have the answer, Moaz, to one of your questions about how we get state-owned enterprises to become African champions. And I feel, both of your companies with, footprints of 20 markets and competing globally in the airport sector are clear examples of that. And, I hope you all take the opportunity to meet both of these super interesting companies after this panel finishes. Modou, on entend là l'expansion de ces champions africains en Afrique, mais on a aussi des champions d'autres pays qui font des expansions au Sénégal, par exemple. L'État, plus loin que gérer ou participer à des entreprises étatiques, a vraiment besoin quand même de jouer aussi le rôle d'arbitre dans l'économie. C'est pas either or, comme on dit. Il faut être soutenir ces entreprises étatiques, mais aussi jouer le rôle d'arbitre.
C'est ça. Non, je crois que le rôle de l'État est essentiel. Le rôle de l'État est essentiel, mais comme je le dis souvent, des entreprises comme la Sonacos ont des missions de service public, c'est-à-dire on ne peut pas ne pas acheter la production des paysans, quelle que soit de la qualité de la production, quelle que soit de la densité des graines. On ne peut pas laisser les graines entre les mains des paysans, on les prend. Ce qui ne serait pas peut-être la position d'une entreprise purement privée, qui aurait à choisir les meilleures graines. On crée aussi des emplois, c'est vous dire que oui, on fait du business, mais on ne peut pas aussi ne pas être dans le social. Mais les risques que nous prenons sont des risques calculés, parce qu'il ne faudrait pas aussi s'engager dans toutes les voies. Et c'est à ce niveau-là qu'on a besoin de l'État. L'État doit pouvoir nous servir parfois de garantie pour faire des levées de fonds assez importants, mais l'État aussi doit parfois intervenir pour réguler le marché. Vous avez suivi l'avant-dernière campagne arachidière au Sénégal. La Sonacos n'avait pu presque rien collecter. En 2019-2020, on a collecté 28 000 tonnes. En 2020-2021, 67 000 tonnes de graines. C'est cette année qu'on a collecté 130 000 tonnes de graines. Pourquoi? Parce que l'État a régulé le marché. D'abord en instaurant une taxe à l'export, mais ensuite l'État a décalé la date d'exportation, la date de démarrage des exportations, pour permettre à la Sonacos d'avoir le temps d'aller acheter la production des paysans. Donc, si l'État se limite à ce rôle, je crois que ça doit pouvoir permettre à l'entreprise de fonctionner selon, comme les entreprises privées, mais aussi d'avoir un œil sur les besoins nationaux. Une société comme la Sonacos doit avoir l'ambition de satisfaire la demande locale en huile d'arachide. Et cette ambition, elle est possible si nous continuons à investir dans l'outil de production, si nous continuons à moderniser l'outil de production, on devrait pouvoir créer un véritable champion, en tout cas dans l'agroalimentaire. Et je crois qu'aujourd'hui, ça doit être les perspectives de la Sonacos, avec bien entendu un soutien de l'État. L'État doit être là, doit veiller, doit avoir ses curseurs, doit réguler le marché et s'en arrêter à là.
Tout à fait. Merci beaucoup. We're going to transition to a Q&A session in just a minute. So start thinking of your questions. While you're doing that, I just want to ask Akim just a final idea really around challenges which go beyond simple day-to-day business or economic development challenges, things which, talking about the climate transition, the very difficult choices that are going to have to be made, the real shocks that are going to come, especially to countries which are not thinking about these things currently. What's the role of the state here?
This one is a really challenging one, and this critical conversation we should definitely be having. And I have to say that I'm a bit sad that the conversation, we're not talking about that more. But quickly, before talking about climate change or climate transition, we also need to tie that to the conversation around energy poverty. We see now the global north has developed, and we saw also the impact of that development on the environment. And now we're seeing situation whereby African countries, I can take an example. We closed a transaction last year for an hydro dam, but the project was delayed by a year because financial institution wanted us to run additional studies on seaweed. I understand that seaweeds are critical for biodiversity, but it will also be interesting to take the impact of that delay on the well-being of the population or the impact on our GDP. That's one side of the conversation. The other side of the conversation is how do we ensure that countries that are carbon sink remains carbon sink? Because the reality is, we won't save the planet just by planting trees. We also have to ensure that countries that are carbon sink remains carbon sink. We have some countries that were carbon sink 10 years ago that today are net emitter. So the reality is, how do we create financial instruments to ensure that countries such as Gabon, that today are net sequestration of more than 100 million tons per year, are getting their fair share for that effort that they're making for the planet? Thank you.
Absolutely. And that's going to be, I think, part of the huge lobbying effort that Africa has to make for its COP, which will come later this year in Egypt. Thanks very much. I'd like to turn to your collective expertise and ideas and questions. Who has one? Put your hand up and we will get a microphone to you. As a woman in the back there, a gentleman in the front here, and a gentleman just here to the left. We'll take those three. So we'll start at the back there. If you could...
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Hi, my name is Yinka Ibukun, and I'm West Africa Bureau Chief for Bloomberg News. And my question is about the idea of transferring underutilized state-owned enterprises to sovereign wealth funds.
Thank you very much. I have an idea who that is going to be answered by. The gentleman in the front here. Can I just compliment my journalist colleague on having asked a real question? Thank you.
My name is Serge Amissa, and I have a question for Sonacos, actually. I really want to understand what prompts the... peut-être je dois la faire en français. Alors, quel est l'élément clé qui a favorisé le redressement de Sonacos? Est-ce que c'est la protection de l'État? Est-ce que c'est un contrôle renforcé de l'État? Est-ce que c'est meilleure compétence des équipes? Enfin, qu'est-ce qui a changé par rapport au passé?
Merci beaucoup. There's a question right here.
Good afternoon. My name is Okpayo Onibokun with British International Investment, formerly CDC Group. Thank you very much for the insightful responses. Question around SOEs and how we define them. So one piece is around commercial viability, but also trying to also limit political interference. So in terms of best practice, especially from the South African case, are there any lessons learned from what South Africa has gone through in terms of helping to ensure that SOEs are not exposed to too much political interference that might deteriorate how they operate? Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll take one more question.
Merci, je suis Massila Kenenge du Fonds gabonais d'investissement stratégique. En fait, ma question, elle est plutôt, peut-être à tous, mais en particulier à la Sonacos. Quels étaient les ingrédients du courage de transformer? C'est la volonté de l'État, enfin, en principe oui, mais bon, c'est ça ma question. Hein. Je voudrais que vous me développiez un peu plus ce pan de la question.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. Thanks very much for your questions. What we'll do is we'll go one by one across the panel, and I think, obviously, Mpumi, there's some questions there about political interference. Patty, I'd actually like to ask you a question as well about human capital and how do we get the best people into positions of authority in state-owned enterprises, because often the brightest minds will end up in the banks or in the oil companies or in the very strong private sector players. How do we get skilled individuals such as yourself into state-owned enterprises? Hakim, you have a question for yourself as well, and Modou, you have lots of questions. So I'll start with you and we'll move across this way in the panel. Merci.
Je vous remercie et je remercie tous ceux qui ont pris la parole et nous ont interpellés.
Alors, je commencerai par la dernière question, les relations qui peuvent avoir entre les dirigeants politiques et les dirigeants d'entreprise. Je donne mon cas personnel, hein, et curieux que cela puisse être, je suis en politique. Je suis un leader. Ben, ça veut dire que cela peut aider. Parce que, bon, toute modestie mise à part, j'ai accès au président de la République. Donc, et souvent, l'influence politique ne vient pas du grand chef. Ça vient des chefs intermédiaires. Mais quand vous êtes vous-même en politique, un leader, les gens quand même vont réfléchir 2 fois avant de vous poser un certain nombre de choses. Je crois que ça m'a beaucoup aidé, cette posture de leader national, de leader politique, pouvant aussi faire bien avancer mes dossiers dans les tiroirs de l'État. Ça, je crois que c'est une expérience qu'il faudrait peut-être partager. Parce que quand vous êtes leader d'une société nationale, vous n'avez pas une main assez longue, vous n'avez pas de bonnes relations avec le sommet, ça peut toujours vous amener à ne pas faire avancer trop vite vos dossiers. Donc, c'est quelque part, voilà, je crois que un lion, pour lui faire face, il faut un autre lion. Ça, c'est pour empêcher que les politiques ne puissent pas donc influencer. Alors, donc ça, je crois que c'est important. Maintenant, je crois que la clé de ce succès, c'est d'abord de faire tout pour maîtriser les dépenses. Parce que quand même, c'est insensé que le Sénégal, qui est le 2e ou 3e producteur d'arachide, qui a une unité de transformation de cette importante matière première, ne puisse pas rendre cette unité rentable. Ça l'a été au début de la création de l'entreprise. Bon, maintenant, je crois que nous avons traversé, nous avons une histoire, et cette histoire-là, il nous faudra la regarder d'en face, en tirer toutes les conséquences et regarder où le bas blesse pour pouvoir apporter des corrections. Donc, une gestion rigoureuse, une gestion transparente, éviter toute influence politique négative, parce que l'influence politique peut être positive. Si on vous aide à avoir une garantie, si on vous aide à lever des fonds, ça peut être intéressant. Et si on vous aide aussi à débloquer vos dossiers, ça peut être intéressant. Mais toute influence politique négative, il faut recruter, il faut dépenser, il y a des activités sportives, des activités culturelles, il faut parrainer. Non, il faut refuser toutes ces choses-là pour rester dans les règles de l'art. Je vous remercie.
C'est une transition parfaite pour votre collègue Mpumi on political interference.
Yes, no, thank you. For South Africa, I think this has been a very steep learning curve. The extent of political interference we've seen, particularly in the last decade, has taught us very important lessons. And those lessons have been learned by the citizenry and the whole country through judicial commissions of inquiry that have actually exposed the extent of the political interference and the extent to which it has led to corruption. Now, what has been important about that public exposure is that it creates sufficient deterrent for any future occurrence of such activities. And that sufficient deterrence comes particularly and will be strengthened by prosecutions, the criminal justice system coming in, arresting people and making sure they are getting stiff sentences. And that, in a sense, should create in the society an overall consciousness about the negative consequences of political interference. Very often, political interference is clouded as pursuing socio-economic objectives and directing investment, when in fact it isn't. And one of the important elements has been to strengthen the corporate governance framework through ensuring adherence to what in South Africa we call King 4 recommendations, and more importantly, introducing other reporting frameworks. ESG is going to be one of the most important ones. In the governance component, we actually integrate all of the other reporting frameworks on governance and accountability. But I must say, the one important issue has also been the empowerment of the Auditor General of South Africa, which organization now has possibly the highest level of integrity and their decisions are well respected in society, and their findings are damning on any institution, and therefore that just creates a sufficient deterrent amongst all institutions. The final one is actually financial consequences. We've seen very clearly going through this particular period that the SOEs, public companies where you've had the largest amount of political interference, are the ones who faced the biggest amount of financial failure. And by definition, nobody in their right mind, even if they were government, would want to pursue something which, one, will get negative ratings from the International Rating Agency, two, will literally collapse like we have in particular instances and not be able to operate, three, would actually never recover to come back and provide those critical services that are required. So important is consequent management. Secondly is just to keep us sane with the various institutions, Auditor General, international news coverage and embarrassment in the public. But the criminal justice system also taking its course and ensuring that corruption does not pay and the cost to the state and right down to the citizenry is well understood out of corrupt activities. I think the future holds independent appointment of independent, clean executives that will run these entities in a credible way and ensure high standards of financial accountability, but also success in the very objective that the state pursues of meeting the needs of its population. Finally, just in society all around, what the public inquiries have done is they've removed the fear potentially around whistleblowing and other people feeling they basically might be prosecuted if they did report. So all of those elements work together to give us what we think is a brighter future with a common understanding and consensus in society about what is required to meet our objectives in a clean way with profitable entities that are run on a basis that brings benefits to the citizens. Thank you.
Thanks, Mpumi.
I'll
Patty,
try and
so
be short,
we sadly don't have much time,
Yes,
but I'd love to hear your responses on this, getting the best and brightest into SOEs.
Yes, and I also, before I answer that, I just want to say that there are positive cases also, because I can say, from especially in our state-owned enterprise, we work very closely with our ministry or line ministry, and it's working. And we have been able to implement our initiatives quite easily. So I want to say there are positive cases also in the rest of Africa. On the staff, yes, it is also one of my mandates as part of, it's legislated in my act that we should train Namibians especially, because it is a field that, especially if you take where Namibia comes from, that where Namibians were excluded from. But the good thing is that, yes, everyone will tell you that no one actually end up in insurance, just going to the university and train. No, most of us end up there by mistake. Myself, I was also not planned, but I won't go in there. But what I want to say is that, yes, we have trained our local Namibians, and we're very fortunate. I must say that the rest of the African continent is having quite a very rich component of experience and well-trained experts. So we, as Namibia, or in the field that we are definitely leveraging on that, and we also share the knowledge with the rest of Africa.
Fantastic. I think it's really important to say that there are many successful state-owned enterprises, and we need to learn and encourage them. Akeem, on this idea of sovereign wealth funds taking up poorly performing SOEs.
Thank you. A quick one on the political interference, really quickly. I think there's a critical element when we design those SOE and the level of independence we give them. When I take the example of the sovereign wealth fund in Gabon, they put us directly under the office of the president. That's to ensure that we avoid what my elder brother was mentioning, and that we used to hear the francophone environment when we say it comes from the top. So you see people coming to you and they say, oh, it's come from the top. But who's the top, right? So that was just a comment to say that there's also sometimes we have to make sure that we design it properly at the very beginning, at the inception. Regarding the transfer regarding the point of transferring underperforming assets to sovereign wealth fund, this is a trend that we're seeing more and more because for various reasons, at some point it could be a bit of a stretch to go directly from having an entity being publicly run to go directly to the private sector. So transferring those assets to sovereign wealth fund is like in the middle, where we can, on one side, ensure the interest of the state, and on the other side, bringing in private sector player who will bring governance, innovation, and help us also, like it was mentioned earlier, strengthen the commercial aspect of those entities. I can quickly take an example. Last year, we took over the National Central Drug Store. It's the public agency in charge of procurement and distribution of drugs in all the public hospitals. It was a defunct government agency that now we're building into a world-class organization where we have fully digitalized the supply chain and ensuring that patients can have drugs at the bed now. So bringing in equity, inclusivity, and creating value. Thank you.
What a great note to end on. Thanks to Moez, our presenter. Thanks to our panelists. Please give them a warm round of applause. And please enjoy your lunch.